Thank you very much, Klaus. As I said on the opening panel, I enormously appreciate the opportunity that the Poulantzas Institute and the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Transform has given me to come and attend this conference. But on this final panel, I want to additionally thank the many members and activists in Syriza who responded so generously and openly and comradely to the provocative questions I raised on Thursday night. As I said on Thursday night, I think that the most important international solidarity that we need to show on the left is not to go starry-eyed where there appears to be an opening for the left, for a left government, and merely watch them in envy that they have got so far compared to most of the rest of us. On the contrary, I think it's our responsibility to try to probe the contradictions, the limits, the difficulties that they are facing despite the success that they've had in mobilizing support and coming to the doorstep of power or coming into office. So we can learn from the limitations, the contradictions, the problems that they are facing. It seems to me that's the best kind of international solidarity, rather than just to be patting each other on the backs. I want to raise, therefore, some of the same provocative questions, especially since I have the opportunity of having the leader of Syriza hear them. But first I'd like to say a few things about the nature of the capitalist crisis that we are in and that a Syriza government, if and when it enters into the state, will be coping with. I think we have to very soberly recognize on the left now that we must stop speaking in terms of the final capitalist crisis. This crisis, which is a very great capitalist crisis, it's probably the fourth global crisis in capitalism's history since the late 19th century, is a very severe one, but it grows out of the successes of capitalism over the last 30, 40 years. We have seen capitalist social relations, the commodification of social life, spread to every corner of the world and to every facet of our lives. We've seen, as one of the speakers said last night, in our own time, either depending how you count it, the third or fourth industrial revolution in capitalism in our lifetimes. You could call it the post-industrial revolution, the techno-computer networking revolution, which has transformed so many aspects of production and finance and of our personal forms of communication with one another. Its great successes, and they have been remarkable, have not ever been without contradictions, even through the heady decade of the 1990s. When one country in the global south after another was being pulled, sometimes kicking and screaming, sometimes very anxiously trying to get into a global capitalism, the 1990s had no less than 72 financial crises. To some extent, the success of this capitalism was precisely the ability in the 1990s to contain those crises, to limit them. And it was only until the crisis developed in the volatility of capitalist finance in the United States itself, right in the heart of the empire, that the crisis became a truly global one and difficult to contain. It is not a crisis in the classic Marxist sense of a production crisis of overaccumulation. It is not a profitability crisis. Neither it was not before the crisis in 2007 erupted, and we all know that the multinational corporations of the world are sitting on very fat profits, reluctant to invest them because of the limits of demand, of consumption, to which the austerity of continuing neoliberalism, of course, contributes. But we also need to recognize, although it's difficult, of course, for people in Greece to see this, that the stimulus of 2009-2010, led by the Americans and the Chinese, but contributed to even by the austerity-conscious Germans, did prevent in most of the capitalist heartland a return to the unemployment levels of the 1930s. Europe has been very successfully integrated into an American-led global capitalist order. I sometimes call this the Canadianization of Europe. We see also in this crisis the contradictions of success. The success being the neoliberalization of Europe, where, as with the expansion of global capitalism generally, the central principle has been the free movement of capital. That has been at the center of the European project, certainly since the economic and monetary union of the mid-1980s. And it has been very successful, and it's involved the role of finance very centrally, not merely being a matter of speculation, being a matter of facilitating the movement of capital for production, being a matter of the use of derivatives, yes, which involves speculation, but nevertheless are essential to integrated production. As capitalists trade with one another, as firms move their profits from one subsidiary to another across the world. The contradiction emerges precisely, again, in the volatility of finance, and in the European case, precisely in the degree of integration that Europe now has with an American-centered capitalism. So when the crisis explodes in the housing market in Cleveland, in Ohio, in the United States, Deutsche Bank takes a terrible hit, because Deutsche Bank held most of the subprime mortgages in the black portions of Cleveland in 2007. And we know it wasn't only Deutsche Bank, it was also the Landesbanken who were buying these mortgage securities. So the contradictions of a neoliberal Europe are also contradictions of the success of capitalism. And the success, we have to admit, has also to be seen despite the fact that neoliberalism ideologically has not been popular since the late 1990s, if it was ever popular. From the time of Seattle, the anti-globalization movements, the World Social Forum, the reaction ideologically to neoliberalism was so great that if you went to a meeting in Davos with the economic elite, they were constantly talking about we need to deal with the problem of poverty. From 2000, 2001 on, that was their main topic. Yes. Nevertheless, the practice of neoliberalism in this crisis has obviously been reinforced with its central dynamic of imposing discipline on labor. That has been reproduced, and it has succeeded in keeping this capitalism going, even amidst this crisis, in a way that does not get out of the crisis, but for the most part has not been challenged, even by social democracy in Europe. Certainly not in practice. It's been challenged rather weakly in the electoral arena, but in practice, social democratic governments, and we now are seeing this with the former great Italian Communist Party, now the Democratic Party, which is to the right of the American Democratic Party now, repeating under its new leader the need to introduce the types of reforms which will involve labor market flexibilization. In this context, we have to realize that the success of capitalism, despite the crisis it has produced, is related, of course, to the appalling weakness of the left and of the organized working class. The success of neoliberalism has its roots in the defeat of trade unionism in the early 1980s. The defensiveness of trade unionism in the face of neoliberalism. It has its roots as well, of course, in the collapse of the communist parties or the turn of communist elites into trying to make themselves into bourgeoisies, as in China, where they are doing so very successfully and very venally. But it also has to do with the weakness of the socialist left, of the anti-neoliberal left, much more broadly. The protest movements, which have been so remarkable and so important against neoliberal globalization since the late 1990s, have not been interested in or capable of going into the state in order to try to change those states so as to challenge capitalist globalization. In fact, this has much to do with a certain anarchist sensibility, which is understandable given the disappointments with communist and social democratic parties in the late 20th century. The anarchist moment in the anti-globalization movement has been captured in the phrase of Holloway's changing the world without taking power. But you can't change the world without going into states. Capitalism doesn't bypass states. Capitalism is reproduced and operates through states, through the property they protect, through the contracts they guarantee, through the regulations that make markets work. Yes. And this is why Syriza is so important, and I think is seen as so important on the whole serious international left. It was already the case that the anti-globalization movement, when Chavez came into power, or when Morales did in Bolivia, did so with the enormous support and enthusiasm of the anti-globalization left. But what Syriza represents in Europe, and this is also seen this way in North America, is so remarkably significant because unlike, with the exception of our Icelandic comrades, unlike the inability of Die Linke in Germany, or the kind of alliance that's emerged through Mélenchon, the PCF, and the League in France, or the smaller socialist parties that have new socialist parties that have emerged in Scandinavia. What Syriza represents in this crisis is the type of movement, the type of party that has been able, through the protests against what's been done to the Greek people in this crisis, come to the doorstep of political power, and more than that, say that we have no alternative but to go into the state to protect our people. And it was on that basis that Syriza came to the doorstep of power 2 years ago and is likely to enter into the state in the near future. What strikes me, and I think much of the international left, as significant, very significant, about Syriza's remarkable success is, first of all, the way in which, and this is not very common amongst parties of this kind of an orientation, of an explicitly socialist orientation, it involved itself in the social movements in a way that was not instrumental but was supportive. I saw this with my own eyes when I was invited by the Poulantzas Institute to give the Poulantzas lecture, and it happened to be in December 2008, just when the student uprising happened. And it was not only impressive the way Syriza threw itself into supporting that uprising, yes, but also did so in a way that didn't try to instrumentalize that uprising to its own narrow electoral benefit. In fact, it cost it electorally initially. Yes. And then that was repeated in very different arenas of struggle in the context of what the horrible austerity that was imposed on Greece in this crisis. Again, an integration with social struggles, a resistance that was not instrumental, that was genuine, that was embedded, that is rare, that is novel, that is incredibly admirable. What is also very notable about Syriza, while it puts a very high priority on not being pushed out of Europe, is an insistence on the rejection of a neoliberal Europe. An explicit identification rather than a naivete about the extent to which the Europe we have is not only a capitalist Europe, but a neoliberal Europe, above all committed to the freedom of capital, to the disciplining of labor. And we all know, of course, that Germany's great success in the last decade was above all based on the disciplining of labor through the Hartz-IV labor restraint, wage restraint, labor flexibilization that the unions agreed to in Germany at the beginning of the 2000s. More than this, it strikes me as what's very significant about Syriza that everyone recognizes, is that it doesn't, however, simply treat the struggle as a struggle of the periphery against the core. It very openly speaks of the necessity to prosecute class struggle inside Greece. The stress that is put on the socialization of finance, the public ownership and control of banking, comes to the heart of this. And then, above all, perhaps, and most important in terms of the new left that started building up in the 1960s and found no place in social democracy or in the old communist parties, is the centrality that Syriza, now for 20 years, has put upon democratizing the state. Not just in response to the charges of clientelism and patronage in the Greek state, but long before that. A central project has been the necessity of democratizing the state, the understanding that you cannot democratize the economy unless you democratize the state. I was most excited in this respect when I read in the political resolution that came with your Congress last summer, that remarkably, and I said this on Thursday night, that remarkably poetic conclusion to the political resolution, which says when we go into the state, we don't expect you to send us there as delegates and say, go do it. What is required is a militant and catalytic, multidimensional movement of subversion, which will keep us going, to which we will have to be accountable, and which itself be throwing up new creative forms of democratization. This is very rare, I think we know, on the socialist left. The questions I was raising on Thursday night, in the most comradely and supportive fashion, however, I'm more convinced than ever after the days I've spent with you, need to be raised again. And that is enough being done in and by Syriza? And is it being done creatively enough to create this militant, catalytic, multidimensional movement, which alone can give you the strength and the support and the creativity to see through the enormous difficulties you will have in the state in a determined, effective way. The constraints will be fantastic. Whether you opt for Plan A or Plan B, whether your attempt to, and I'm sure it will be done, to reverse the memoranda will lead to the kinds of consequences that may entail you being pushed out of Europe even if you don't want to go. Whether those options are even available to you will depend on how seriously you take as an organization this promise of creating such a movement. So, the questions are these, and I have only a few minutes left. Let me put them very quickly. At the level of your membership organizations, is it easy for those who haven't been activists in Syriza, in any of its tendencies, who are active in the social solidarity networks, to come to party meetings? Or do they arrive and become alienated by arcane debates between the tendencies over this word or that word in a resolution? In these membership organizations, is there a capacity building going on? Because the great danger, which has been proven already in Bolivia, and was very much the case, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, is that all of your capable party members will be drawn into the state. Who will be left in the party to do this movement building, to do this capacity building? Is there debate, is there education taking place amongst the membership and amongst supporters over Plan A and Plan B? I know this is difficult to discuss in public. It's difficult to discuss in the media. But if this is not being discussed amongst the members and supporters, what will happen when you have to make these hard decisions? Are you not behaving as though you will be delegated, cut off from the base? How open is the party genuinely, given the local and regional elections that are taking place, to being animators of popular creativity in terms of new forms of public administration at a local level? When you go into the solidarity networks, do you encourage people to talk about different ways in which their community should be run and operated and connected to the state? This question, this series of questions, needs to be asked about every tendency in Syriza. It's not a question of one tendency or another. It's a question of all of them, that all of them need to be engaging in. And I ask these questions only because it matters so much to the left internationally outside of Greece that you don't screw this up. Not that you necessarily come through with a socialist utopia tomorrow, right? But that one sees that the attempt that's being made is a creative socialist one. We are operating, I'll end with this, with two different time scales. You in Greece are operating in the time scale now of 2 months to 2 years. The weakness of the international left outside of Greece is that we're operating on a 20-year perspective. Doing what you did in 20 years, building the kind of party capable of going into the state. Okay. We will try our best to give you international support despite our weakness. The dangerous thing from our perspective is that your failure may demobilize us. I know that's a heavy burden to put on you. It's the least of your worries in some ways. But in all honesty, this is what we need to tell you. Thank you.